I never thought I would find myself here, telling a story that contradicts everything I once held dear. My name is David Levin. For 65 years, I dedicated my life to reason, science, and secular humanism. Religion was something I respected academically but dismissed personally. Then, on a crisp autumn evening in October 2023, everything I thought I knew was shattered. One moment I was hiking along a familiar trail near my home in Vermont. The next, I was lying at the bottom of a ravine, my body broken, my consciousness fading into darkness. In that silence after my pulse weakened, I found myself floating above my own broken form, helpless, voiceless, utterly alone. But that wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I was drawn upward into a light more profound than anything I had ever experienced, a brilliance that spoke of meaning beyond my comprehension. And there, within that radiance, I encountered something my rational mind had always rejected: consciousness beyond physical existence. Not just consciousness, but presence, intelligent, loving, knowing. I had spent my career teaching comparative philosophy at Dartmouth, dismissing spiritual experiences as mere neurological events. What I experienced next will challenge everything you thought you knew about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence. What I witnessed defies the materialist framework I had built my entire worldview upon. Stay with me until the end, because I am about to tell you how I glimpsed something that no equation or theory had prepared me for: a reality where consciousness is not merely an emergent property of brain function but something far more fundamental. My near-death experience has cost me my professional reputation, challenged my closest relationships, and dissolved everything I thought I knew, because the testimony you're about to hear contradicts the very foundations of what I once believed. I was born to secular Jewish parents in Boston. My father was a physicist, my mother a cultural anthropologist. Our home celebrated human achievement rather than divine revelation. Dinner conversations centered around scientific discoveries, philosophical debates, and social justice, never prayer or faith. I followed my parents' path into academia, eventually becoming a professor of philosophy with a focus on epistemology and scientific naturalism. My lectures on consciousness often concluded that the mind was merely an emergent property of the brain. Nothing more, nothing less. Then came that fateful October evening. I had decided to take my usual sunset hike along the ridge trail near my home. The autumn colors were at their peak, and I wanted to clear my head after a particularly intense faculty meeting. I remember pausing at the overlook, watching the sun sink below the mountains. I took a step back to capture a photo, and felt the ground give way beneath my foot. The fall was both instant and eternal. I tumbled over the edge, my body striking rocks and tree roots. Pain exploded through my chest and head. Then suddenly, silence. The pain vanished. The sounds of the forest faded away. I was looking down at my own crumpled form some 20 feet below. A hiker on a lower trail was already rushing toward my body, phone in hand, shouting for help. I wanted to call out to tell them I was somehow still here, but I had no voice. I tried to reach out but discovered I had no physical form. I was consciousness without body, awareness without matter. I felt myself being drawn upward, away from the scene below. The forest, the mountains, the physical world itself began to recede. I wasn't moving through space as we understand it. It was more like awareness itself was expanding, consciousness shifting into a broader dimension of reality. Then came the light. Not a light that illuminates objects in darkness, but light that seemed to be existence itself. It wasn't blinding, though its intensity was beyond anything physical. It was sentient, knowing, intelligent. This radiance knew me, not just my history and actions, but the innermost parts of my being I had hidden even from myself. Then the light began to communicate, not through words or language, but through direct knowing. Ideas, concepts, and understandings formed in my consciousness without sound or symbol. The first revelation shook the foundations of my materialist worldview. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. It precedes physical reality. The brain is more like a receiver or transducer than a generator. But this contradicts everything we know about neuroscience, I thought. Damage to the brain impairs consciousness. Drugs alter perception. Death ends awareness. I was shown how the universe itself is more like a thought than a thing, patterns of information and meaning rather than just particles and forces. Matter isn't the fundamental reality, it's a manifestation of something deeper. What we call physical laws are more like habits or patterns in cosmic consciousness than mechanical rules. The implications were staggering. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then death is not an ending but a transition. The brain doesn't generate consciousness, it constrains it into individual experience. When the brain ceases to function, consciousness returns to its natural, unbounded state. As I grappled with these revelations, the experience deepened. I found myself in what I can only describe as a realm of pure knowledge, a vast library of understanding where all questions led to deeper questions. Here, I encountered other consciousnesses, not as separate entities but as distinct patterns within a greater wholeness. Communication was instantaneous and complete. There was no need for words, no possibility of misunderstanding. Among these consciousnesses, I recognized some, my grandparents, colleagues who had passed away, even historical figures whose work had influenced my own thinking. These weren't supernatural beings but conscious patterns that had once been channeled through physical forms like mine. This cannot be real, I thought. This is my oxygen-deprived brain creating hallucinations to ease the transition to non-existence. In response, I was shown the limitations of my materialist explanations. The clarity, coherence, and information content of what I was experiencing far exceeded what a dying brain could generate. This wasn't the chaotic firing of failing neurons but an expansion into greater order and meaning. The consciousness communicating with me then showed me something that challenged even my skepticism, verifiable information I could not possibly have known. Specific details about ongoing research in my field that had not been published, the locations of objects in my office I had long forgotten about, conversations my colleagues were having at that very moment. These would later be confirmed when I returned. Why am I being shown this? I asked. The answer came not as words but as understanding. I was being given an opportunity to bridge worlds, to bring back testimony not of religious doctrine but of the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. My scientific training and philosophical skepticism weren't mistakes to be discarded but tools I could use to translate what I was experiencing into terms others might understand. Then came a revelation that particularly struck me as a philosopher of mind. The hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes could ever give rise to subjective experience, was precisely backward. The real question wasn't how matter produces consciousness but how consciousness manifests as matter. The material world emerges from consciousness, not the other way around. As this understanding formed, I became aware that my experience was nearing its end. The consciousness communicating with me conveyed that I would return to physical existence. I would remember this experience, not as a vague dream but with the clarity of authentic knowing. No, I thought, I want to remain in this understanding. Physical existence seems so limited by comparison. The response was compassionate but firm. My physical journey wasn't complete. I had work to do, not to start a new religion or spiritual movement, but to bridge the worlds of science and direct experience, to help articulate a more complete understanding of consciousness. Then everything began to recede, the light, the presence, the vast field of knowledge. I felt myself being pulled backward, through layers of existence, back toward the physical world I had left. Suddenly, pain returned, searing throughout my broken body, pulsing in my head. I heard urgent voices, felt hands stabilizing my neck and spine, the cold metal of a backboard beneath me. "He's conscious," someone shouted. "Sir, can you hear me? Don't try to move." My eyes opened to the harsh light of headlamps. Rescue workers hovered over me. Night had fallen completely. I had been unconscious for over an hour as they worked to reach me and stabilize my condition. "Consciousness," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's primary, not emergent." The EMT exchanged glances with her partner. "He's disoriented," she said. "Likely concussion. Multiple fractures. Let's get him down and transported." As they carried me down the trail to a waiting ambulance, I tried to hold onto the clarity of what I had experienced. Unlike dreams that fade upon waking, this experience grew sharper, more coherent. I knew with absolute certainty that what I had encountered wasn't a hallucination or near-death brain activity. It was more real than anything I had ever known. The medical assessment was grim. For broken ribs, a fractured pelvis, severe concussion, internal bleeding requiring emergency surgery. But as I lay in the hospital bed during the weeks that followed, my physical pain was overshadowed by the profound cognitive dissonance I experienced. Everything I had taught, everything I had believed about consciousness being merely a product of neural activity, now seemed not just wrong but fundamentally backward. Yet I was a scientist, an academic. I couldn't simply discard decades of research and evidence based on a single subjective experience, no matter how profound. So I began to research, not to confirm my prior materialist views but to genuinely explore alternative models of consciousness. I discovered the work of philosophers like David Chalmers on the hard problem of consciousness, neuroscientists like Christoph Koch on integrated information theory, physicists like Sir Roger Penrose on quantum approaches to consciousness, and researchers like Sam Parnia on verified near-death experiences. I read accounts from thousands of others who had experiences similar to mine, not just vague tunnels of light but coherent encounters with a reality beyond physical existence. Many reported obtaining verifiable information they couldn't have known through normal means. The similarities across cultures, ages, and belief systems were striking. As my body healed, my mind grappled with reconciling my experience with scientific understanding. I wasn't ready to abandon empiricism, quite the opposite. I wanted to expand empirical investigation to include direct experience of consciousness itself as valid data. 3 months after my fall, I returned to campus. My colleagues welcomed me back warmly, but I knew the conversation I needed to have would test those relationships. I scheduled a department colloquium titled Consciousness Reconsidered, a philosophical and personal journey. The lecture hall was packed that afternoon. Students, faculty from various departments, even the dean attended. My department chair introduced me with obvious concern about what I might say. I had been a reliable advocate for scientific naturalism for 30 years. Now I stood before them, physically diminished by my injuries but possessed of a clarity I had never known before. My colleagues, students, friends, I began, 3 months ago, I experienced something that has forced me to reconsider the foundations of my philosophical position on consciousness. What I'm about to share is not a rejection of scientific inquiry but an argument for expanding its scope. For the next hour, I shared my experience, not as a conversion narrative but as a data point that demanded explanation. I outlined the limitations of purely materialist accounts of consciousness and proposed that we consider consciousness as a fundamental rather than emergent property of reality. I am not advocating for any religious interpretation, I emphasized. I am suggesting that the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved precisely because we have the relationship backward. What if consciousness isn't produced by physical processes but is instead the context in which physical processes occur? The reaction was predictably mixed. Some colleagues were visibly uncomfortable, others curious. My department chair looked as though I had betrayed every principle of academic rigor. A few younger faculty members appeared genuinely intrigued. During the Q&A, the challenges came quickly. Isn't it more parsimonious to conclude you experienced a hallucination produced by your injured brain? Asked the neuroscience department head. That was my first hypothesis as well, I replied. But it doesn't account for the verified information I obtained that I couldn't have known through normal means. Such as, she pressed. I described how during my experience, I had seen the exact location of a manuscript I had misplaced in my office years earlier, behind a specific book on a specific shelf. When I returned, I found it exactly where my vision had shown me. More significantly, I had been shown details of an unpublished experiment a colleague was conducting, specific parameters and even preliminary results that I could not have known. When confirmed later, they matched precisely what I had been shown. The questions continued for nearly 2 hours. I didn't claim to have all the answers, only that my experience suggested our current paradigm was incomplete. I proposed a research initiative to explore consciousness from multiple perspectives: neuroscience, physics, philosophy, and phenomenology. The weeks that followed were difficult. Some colleagues stopped speaking to me entirely. Others suggested I take medical leave to fully recover. The department chair called me to his office to express concern about the direction of my research. What surprised me, however, was that not everyone rejected my account. A group of faculty from diverse disciplines, quantum physics, religious studies, cognitive science, anthropology, reached out privately, expressing interest in collaborative research. Students filled my office hours, sharing their own questions and experiences they had previously been afraid to discuss in academic settings. My marriage suffered tremendously. My wife, Rebecca, a clinical psychologist, initially attributed my experience to trauma and brain injury. When I persisted in exploring its implications, our relationship became strained. "I didn't marry a mystic," she told me one evening. "I married a rational philosopher who understood the difference between subjective experience and objective reality." "I'm still committed to understanding objective reality," I replied. "But what if our concept of objectivity has been too narrow? What if consciousness itself is an objective feature of the universe, not just a subjective epiphenomenon?" The cost has been high. My academic standing has diminished. Research collaborations have evaporated. My marriage ended after 30 years. Some colleagues still treat me as though I've suffered a mental breakdown rather than a breakthrough in understanding. Yet I've gained something immeasurable. A community of serious thinkers from across disciplines has formed around these questions. We've established a center for consciousness studies that approaches the topic from multiple methodological perspectives, including rigorous first-person phenomenology alongside third-person empirical investigation. My students have never been more engaged. Many report that for the first time, they feel permission to integrate their subjective experiences with their scientific education rather than compartmentalizing them. I don't claim certainty. I hold my new understanding provisionally, as all good scientists and philosophers should. But I can no longer accept the dogmatic materialism that dismisses conscious experience as merely an epiphenomenon of neural activity. The evidence, both objective and subjective, points toward consciousness as something more fundamental. If you're reading this, whether you're a scientist, philosopher, or simply someone curious about the nature of reality, I invite you to consider my testimony. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Investigate for yourself. Examine the growing body of research on non-local consciousness, verified near-death experiences, and the limitations of purely materialist explanations of mind. Most importantly, take your own conscious experience seriously as data. The fact that you experience anything at all, rather than being a philosophical zombie going through the motions of life without inner awareness, is the most remarkable fact of your existence. No current materialist theory adequately explains why there is something it is like to be you. My name is David Levin. I was a philosopher who denied the primacy of consciousness my entire career, until I died briefly and discovered that consciousness cannot be reduced to neural activity. Now I can say with conviction, consciousness is not what we have, it's what we are. The greatest mystery isn't why conscious beings exist in an unconscious universe, but how the infinite field of consciousness manifests as apparently separate beings in an apparently physical world.